Boom. All right. And get this up on Facebook. 1 second. Get this going, all set up. All right. Okay. Okay. Birds and Bytes. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started here. So thank you everybody for being here. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and I'm super stoked to see you all here this evening. I'm really excited to see all your lovely faces and for our topic here this evening. Obviously this is a Chicago Ornithological Society program. We don't have any future Birds and Bytes scheduled just yet, but we do have another fantastic event coming up here in a couple of weeks. It's part of our Compelling Speakers series that we do in partnership with Peggy Notebart Nature Museum in Chicago Audubon, and that will be taking place Thursday, July 30th at 6 p.m. So definitely hop on over to our website to check out that and other awesome future events. Also, as part of Birds and Bytes, this is a riff on our popular Birds and Beers program that we used to do back when, you know, we all used to actually hang out in large gatherings. Imagine that. So naturally, we're trying to kind of keep some of that element alive here. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris, I'm sorry, not Chris, to Bob to talk about our partner brewery this evening. So take it away, Bob.
Thanks so much, Edward. So we have been choosing a brewery to support through the Birds and Bytes series, and so this time around we have Imperial Oak Brewing, which is based in Willow Springs, right beside the Palos region. And Imperial Oak has been around since 2013. It's a fantastic locally owned brewery, and in addition to them sponsoring, or us sponsoring them really tonight, I have a bit of news, and I'm going to share my screen quickly. Let's see if I can do that. Imperial Oak has begun to brew something new, and that is Piping Plover Pale Ale. And so this is a pale ale in honor of Monty and Rose, and it's going to be released on August 1st. So it's an ale brewed with cactus pear juice in honor of the prickly pear cactus that's found in the piping plover's natural habitat of Great Lakes dunes. So a portion of the proceeds will benefit Chicago Ornithological Society and our education and conservation programs. If you're interested in acquiring some piping plover pale ale, you can head out to Imperial Oak. August 1st at noon is when this will be released, and it'll be available in cans for curbside pickup or enjoyment on their patio, which I believe is set up to be fairly socially distant. And I think they're going to even have some food trucks there that day, and hopefully if the weather holds, everybody can stay outside and safely enjoy a beer in honor of our most famous local birds. So yeah, excited to announce this today, and you'll be hearing more about it. But Piping Plover Pale Ale, thanks to Imperial Oak Brewery for wanting to do this, and then also giving back by donating a portion of proceeds. And I'll turn it back over to Edward, I believe.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. I'm super excited. I expect to see everybody here camped out at the front door all morning. I know I will be. So thank you so much. If you can use your applause reaction here, I think this definitely deserves some applause here. Finally getting a piping plover beer for our own Monty and Rose. Pretty awesome stuff. So thank you. Thank you so much, Imperial Oak Brewing, for being such awesome partners in this project. And just being heroes and champions for the birds. All right, so without further ado, I think we're going to go ahead and pass it over to our speaker for the night here. So tonight we have a really fantastic guest, a regular with the COS speaker circuit because he's just so awesome, and former COS president and founder of Third Coast Birding, Geoff Williamson, also the fellow who has been leading the North Pond Birdwalks. Many of us have met him in that capacity for many, many, many years. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Geoff to talk to us about birding with radar tonight. Thanks so much for being here, Geoff. Round of applause for Geoff.
Hey, everybody. Good to, I guess, sort of see folks around here. And delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you folks and talk a little bit about radar and birding and radar and these kinds of things. I'm told by Edward to keep it to like somewhere in the half hour to 45-minute range. So I've got my little stopwatch here. I'm gonna set that thing going and keep myself under control. So and Edward, feel free to give me the hook if I end up going on too long.
Start playing the Oscar music.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen if I can find this thing. We tested this out before and it should work okay. Let's see. Here we go. All right. So, okay, so I'm gonna talk to you about radar, and specifically the kind of a publicly available weather radar system that the National Weather Service has. By publicly available, I mean that the products from this radar are broadly available to people via the internet. And we'll talk a little bit about how it is that we can observe birds using this radar. And so what I want to do is to go a little bit over the history of what is sometimes called radar ornithology. It's nearly as old as radar itself, and some of the Illinois connections to that. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how it is that radar works. And the reason that I want to do that is an understanding about how radar works is going to be helpful to interpreting the imagery that you get of radar over the internet. And then we will kind of look at a lot of radar images and practice our interpretations of that. And at the end, a little bit about where this is going currently, or I think that's in the middle too. So I first encountered radar, seeing birds on radar back in the I guess the 20th century. The 20th century is so far ago now. It seems like that was the century that always was for someone of my age, and now we're a quarter of the way through the next century. It seems kind of weird. Anyway, at that time, I was a subscriber to this Canadian publication, Birders Journal, which had a whole lot of interesting bird articles in it. I was really into gulls at that time, and there were some good gull ID articles in there. And I ran into this article by a fellow, John Black, who was at Brock University up in Ontario, and he gave an explanation of how it is that you could use this what's called the NexRad, or the next generation radar system, to see birds. And he was operating his own little radar station that he was able to use to try to get a calibration on how to interpret, to give a kind of rough estimate of the number of birds based on what you were seeing in the radar imagery. And so I shared some of this stuff on what was the only way for birders around the state to communicate with each other back at those times, which was the IBET listserv, which is still functioning, but may not be the medium of choice for everybody. So that was a couple decades ago, but like I said, that the history of birds on radar goes back almost to the beginning of radar itself. radar was developed back in the or functioning radar systems for detecting flying objects were deployed first in the 1930s. And it was not that long afterwards that people were seeing images on the radar signal return that were thought to be due to the presence of birds. So there was an article in Nature, the Nature journal, back in 1945 about this. And following that, there were a lot of efforts to figure this out and see what was going on. And it wasn't that much longer after that, there was even a book published with the title Radar Ornithology. Some of the early stuff that was done in this area was in Illinois. Richard Graeber and Frank Belrose were doing some studies specifically in terms of nocturnal migration and detecting of birds undergoing nocturnal migratory flights using radar systems. These folks were also, I think, early on the scene with regard to acoustic monitoring of migration. So that was kind of interesting. And this fellow here, Ron Larkin, who was a faculty member down at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, also active with the Illinois Natural History Survey, he and his students were doing work in this domain of radar ornithology. And one of his PhD students at the time, Rob Deal, was doing a study trying to correlate what kind of strength of signal was being seen via radar with observations by birders on the ground. And so he enlisted a bunch of Chicago area birders collecting the so-called ground truth to correlate with the radar observations. And although I don't know whether, where or whether any of this was published, but I did dutifully go out and collect some ground truth data to send back to Rob at that time. That was kind of fun. And then this fellow, Sidney Gothrow, who for a long time was operating the radar ornithology laboratory at Clemson University, where he was a faculty member. I learned a lot of the ins and outs of how to look at radar signals in terms of in their interpretation via birds from material that he had posted up on his lab's website. He did his graduate work down at LSU, and both his master's and his PhD theses were written on using radar systems in biology, radar biology, and most of his interests were in birds. After he retired from Clemson University, he was still active, collaborating with some folks at UIUC that were doing some of this radar ornithology work, and I think he's in South Carolina now, still doing consulting on these topics. So it's kind of a long history. And today we've got people at the Cornell University Laboratory of Ornithology that are doing a lot of different kinds of projects, some of which, such as the BIRDCAST project, incorporating information that comes from radar measurements. And so this is looking at essentially our observations and our fellow birders, putting stuff into eBird, together with details about weather and radar observations in order to try to do forecasting of migratory phenomena in the avian world. And the individual depicted down on this slide is Andy Farnsworth, who's running a number of different projects, including this one at the lab of O. So what is radar? Radar stands for radio detection and ranging. And the essential idea is that you have some kind of energy source that's sending out a little bursts of electromagnetic energy in a particular direction. And as depicted in this little graphic, you emit this thing in a particular direction, and if it hits something, some of the energy will reflect back, and you can detect it back at the source. And essentially, the essential idea is the amount of time that it takes for this signal to go out, strike the object, and reflect back. That time lag tells you about how far the object is away. The strength of the signal that you get, how much stuff you get back, tells you something about how big the target was, or the collective target. And there's even, you can design the electromagnetic signal so that you get additional information, such as from the Doppler shift. If you could detect the Doppler shift, that gives you information about the velocity of the target as well. And certainly a lot of this technology was developed with military purposes in mind. I mentioned there was this fellow, a individual from Scotland. I'm spacing on his first name, Watkins Watt, Robert Watkins Watt, I think it was the fellow that got the first functioning radar system for detecting airplanes working in the mid-1930s, and that was important for Great Britain during World War II and the Battle of Britain, for a little bit of advance warning about when all the German bombers were coming in. But anyways, this basic system is to send out the pulse of electromagnetic energy, look for some kind of return signal, send another pulse out, maybe in a different direction, look for a return signal, and kind of sweep over the entire range of directions that you want to get information from. And then you can integrate all the received, the information that you get from these received signals back into some kind of image that enables you to tell what objects, or the presence of objects, and how big those objects are out in your field of view. Now, I mentioned this NexRad radar system, which was deployed during the 1990s. And if you remember that Birders Journal article that I mentioned, that came out in December of 1998. So it was after the completion of the rollout of this new system, just more advanced. We had weather radar previously, but this was just more advanced radar with a lot of bells and whistles on it to provide state-of-the-art, at that time, coverage of all the weather phenomena that could be detected via radar. And the basic idea there too is that you're sending out this electromagnetic signal, this radio signal. It hits things and reflects back off the targets that it hits. And some of the stuff that it hits can be snowflakes, raindrops, hailstones, and this kind of stuff. So some of the return radar signal is going to be functionally, we'll talk about this as being rain. I think I'll use the term weather quite a bit, but essentially it's the falling raindrops. And you can see from this map of the U.S. that there's quite a bit of coverage, nearly over the entire continental U.S. And each one of these little circles that you see on the map, with the little black dot in the middle, represents a weather radar station that's collecting. So you've got the radar devices at the middle of each of these circles, and the circles represent the area that particular device is intended to cover. So here's my my wonderful artwork here, kind of depicting the situation that we have when you're detecting raindrops. And in this slide and the next slide are essentially our essential guide for what's going on when the radar signal reflects weather, and what's going on when the radar signal reflects birds. And understanding the basic phenomenon will enable us to properly interpret the presence of birds on these radar products that we get from the National Weather Service and other sources. So these kinds of dark smears on the top, those are clouds. Those are our rain clouds. These little dashed things are the falling raindrops. Here's our radar station, and it's emitting this energy out this way. And anything that the radar signal hits you get a reflected signal coming back. And so all along the way, it's hitting raindrops. And basically, although I have this drawing, the radar kind of pointing up into the sky, you can think of the radar as kind of going out horizontally, but because the surface of the Earth is curved, and then actually there's some refraction of the radar signal too, so the radar signal is bending downward as well. So, but this radar signal, it's not pointing up in the sky, it's kind of pointing horizontally, and all along the way, it's drifting slightly up. So further away from the radar station, we're going to be higher up, hitting objects that are higher up. But the rain is coming from high enough up that everywhere that we are getting a return radar signal, we're capable of seeing rain at that distance. So remember, the basic idea is we see something going out, it hits an object that comes back, the amount of time it takes for that return signal gives us a sense of the range. And so we are able to see raindrops over the entire range of the radar. So everywhere in these little circles here, we are able to see rain. The situation with birds, however, is a little bit different. All right, so these little things, these are your standard bird symbols. And the birds, unlike the raindrops, they're predominantly flying at a particular height off the ground. So and especially when we're seeing lots of signal from return from birds, that's generally when we have big migrating masses of birds moving, and they're migrating at a particular height above the ground. And things that are close to the ground, or there's an absence of migratory birds, let's say, that are close to the ground, so close to the radar station, the radar signal actually isn't striking any of the birds. And because there's a maximum height at which the birds are being flying, there's a certain distance away from the radar station. So at this point here, that the radar signal is now traveling above the height of the birds. So when we see a return signal in radar from birds, it's generally from a little bit, a little distance away from the radar station out to a particular point. And then past that point, we're not expecting to see birds because we're looking kind of at too high a height above the ground and there aren't any birds there. So here's the first of our radar images, and I will be showing you radar images that I grabbed off of the National Weather Service website. And I sent to Edward, and he's told me that he'll be distributing this to the audience tonight. I have a little handout that includes all the URLs on the web, the addresses for the websites from which I'm displaying stuff, and one of those is a place where you can point your browser and get an image like this, which is of the radar station. It's the radar imagery that reflects the collected signals coming off the radar station that covers our area. And so just to kind of orient you around this image a little bit, these white lines are the geographic boundaries between, up here is Wisconsin, here's Illinois, this is the border between Illinois and Iowa, the Mississippi River kind of going down there, here's the border between Illinois and Wisconsin, here's the lower portion of Lake Michigan, the state of Michigan is over here, the state of Indiana is down there, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but there's a little white word in there that says Chicago. And so this is, roughly speaking, where I am right now. And this is a nice reference point because if you use the information from John Black's article back in Birders Journal to get a sense of volume of birds, what you can do is look at the strength of the radar signal at a distance from the radar station that is approximately equal to the distance from the radar station we use in Chicago. So here I give on the right this little kind of guide for interpreting this thing, is that you go to this chart here, you see where Chicago is, you see what color Chicago's sitting in, it's this kind of reddish color. You go over to the scale over here, here's the red stuff, somewhere between 8 and 16 in the units of what are called dBz. And so 8 to 16 is somewhere between few birds and birds. And so this thing here is this circular area that represents the birds. This stuff up here is rainfall. Now, if we go back to our little diagrams, I can see rain at any distance from the radar station. and I can see birds only out to a particular distance. And then closer to that, I should expect kind of a weaker signal because there's not that many birds down there. A lot of the birds are up there. And this is reflected in this picture. This kind of circular pattern is very typical for what the presence of birds on one of these radar images looks like. We generally get, there's this speckly stuff here in the middle, which is not quite at the level of this red stuff. It's down kind of in some of these ranges. So there's not a whole lot of signal close. And then we get this very strong signal that's relatively constant as the radar signal is passing through this basic broadly spread out flock of birds that's moving. This is I should mention too that this is an image that comes from, I think, 4 in the morning. The migratory phenomena that we have here in North America is that most of our birds are migrating at night. And so the large volumes of birds that are detectable by radar are in the nighttime when it's dark out. And so we see the presence of these birds in this very circular pattern. And then when the radar signal is far enough out from the radar station so that it's starting to travel above the height of the birds, we see a weakening of the signal. This yellow color represents a lower value of dBz than the red color. It's kind of like a cold to hot color map here, going from blue to green to yellow, orange, and then red. And the rain, however, we can see all the way out to the distance that the radar signal is able to see. And I'll go back again a couple slides. These basic circles are the coverage areas that each station is meant to reach. And you can kind of see the edge of that here, there's a nice smooth, it looks like the edge of a circle here on the edge of the rainfall. That's actually just, the image is just cut off at that point. And so there's actually stuff to see past that, but we're only displaying out to a circle of about this much. And so we're seeing the rain stuff, the rainfall over here. Birds tend to look very circular. There's this circular pattern or kind of a donut pattern and very uniform. Rainfall tends to be kind of blotchy with a lot of variability in the signal values. These purple things are bigger than the red things, and you can see some yellow mixed in, and it's kind of splotchy. And we're going to see a bunch of these images, and basically I would just try to point out, these are birds, this is rain. There's other things you can see too, but that's the majority. You can see swarms of insects sometimes show up. And so you can use these basic guidelines for the dBz values at Chicago on the Chicago-based radar. And basically, if you're below below 10, it's relatively little activity. Between 10 and 20, it's moderate activity, and above 20, it's a lot of birds. And we'll see that it's actually quite rare to see signals at 30 dBz or bigger. These scales, the scale value that's used to measure these things is on a logarithmic scale, which means that as I go from 10 to 20 and 20 to 30, I'm increasing by this same value of 10 dBz. But for every 10 dBz that I go up, the amount of stuff that the radar signal is hitting goes up by a factor of 10. So there's like a 10-fold increase from 10 to 20, another 10-fold increase to 20 to 30. So the number of birds present with a value of 30 on this signal is 100 times the size of what you see when there's 10. And then from 10 to 0 is another 10-fold increase. I'm also going to be looking at these surface weather maps, in part to kind of interpret what's going on, but it's another tool for helping us utilize radar and to predict the presence of birds. And also I want to point out that, here, what we're seeing is that I'm taking these things from the Weather Channel's website. And what they do for us is take this basic weather radar information that they're getting the feed from the National Weather Service, and they take those radar images and stitch them together over a map of the United States. And here you can see this rainfall. Here's some more rainfall. Here's some precipitation as well that comes back as some kind of color image on there. And on the weather maps, they replace those intensity values with their own kind of scale here and colors. Like they know this is snow, so they made it white, even though, you know, maybe it's the same intensity of precipitation as this stuff. And then there's also, you know, the high pressure and the low pressure systems, these fronts, warm fronts and cold fronts that are on there. If we put these two images side by side, this is basically, I guess the date is April 28th in 2004 at 5 in the morning. It's still dark out when this is the picture. And you can see over here, here's Lake Michigan. Here's some rain coming in on the western shore of Lake Michigan. Down at the very southern tip, there's some rain. This is actually, this image here of the weather map is from 5:30. And this one here is from 5:05, and so the rain has moved in this thing. It's moved. I guess it's kind of coming over towards this side a little bit, but basically we're seeing the rain over Lake Michigan in the weather map, and we're seeing that as well in the raw radar signal. But the birds that we see here on the signal from the National Weather Service have been removed by the Weather Channel or the wetweather.com because they're trying to show us the weather. They're not interested to show us the birds. So in order to get these kinds of pictures of the weather map and to use weather radar to construct these things, the meteorologists have to remove the birds from the radar signals. Okay, so points that we've covered here is that the birds look like a kind of a roughly circular pattern of fairly even intensity that only changes to a lower intensity value right at the edge of the circle. Rainfall looks blotchy, less uniform, less structured. These are the URLs for where I'm getting these images from, and as I mentioned, we'll provide those to whomever's interested so that you can go and look at these things yourself. Okay, so here's let me see here. Okay, so here this depicts that 5 a.m. and now a 6 a.m. image. And I don't remember exactly when sunrise was on April 28th, but I'm guessing that it's approximately 6 o'clock in the morning. And what we're seeing here is the presence of the rainfall. An hour later, some of that rain is still there. Here we see at 5 o'clock in the morning, we see all these birds flying with this intensity at the level of about 15 dBz. And then an hour later, the bird pattern is starting to disappear. And what's happening now is that all these birds that are up in the air flying at 5 o'clock, it's daybreak and they're all coming to Earth. They're landing and they're looking for food and shelter. And so the weaker radar signal here represents a smaller volume of birds. I'm going to do a sequence of images now from the fall of that year. We're going to look at sunset on September 6th, sunrise the next day, and then sunset the day after that. And this is during weather conditions that were conducive to birds migrating. It's the fall now, so birds are migrating south. Here's the weather map. We have this cold front coming in from the northwest, coming this way. It's just past Chicago. And behind it is this high weather system that's bringing these northwest winds, and the northwest winds are what the birds like to have when they're migrating south, or into winds with a northerly component. And what we see on the radar image is a lot of birds aloft in the air.
Any of this is like a few tablespoons. Okay, finish it then.
Make sure I'm not like.
I'm sure you're not what.
Okay, I guess that wasn't a question. All right. So these are the birds that have taken off. They're on the ground during the day. this cold front passes. It's great conditions to migrate, and so all the birds come aloft, and we see this basically circular blob, you know, fairly even density through most of it. You know, all this stuff here may be a higher density of birds down in the Palos area, what have you, but they've come up. We can see some of the rainfall, again, that difference in pattern between birds on the radar signal and the rainfall type structure of the radar return. And you can see in here that kind of rainfall just ahead of the front that's coming through. So here's all these birds aloft, right? And then, you know, they go in the air and they're flying south. So we scroll ahead to the next morning, and we still have birds up in the air over the Chicago region. Different birds. The birds that we saw in this image, they've gone further south. So these are birds that are flying in. The front hasn't made a whole heck of a lot of progress, but it's kind of moved enough down to the southeast that we no longer have any rainfall in here. And we've have a higher intensity of birds now than we did taking off. So there's been a big influx of birds coming in. And then so this is at sunrise, and then these birds are going to land and look for food and shelter and whatnot on the ground. And then because there's going to be, again, that night, good weather conditions for migration, they're going to take off in the evening and keep flying. And so what we see here is an image right after sunset. So sunset was 7:15. This image is about 7:30. So this is the initial takeoff. And what we see is birds coming up off the ground, but these birds are not resting on Lake Michigan. And so we're not seeing, we see very little radar signal out over the lake. A little bit later in the night, the birds are going to be creeping out over the lake, and we're going to see more and more radar signal out over the lake there. These areas along here, these higher intensities, these purple colors represent a higher density of birds. We are blessed along the shores of Lake Michigan during migratory periods. We get a higher density of birds in those areas because the birds flying at night that end up over Lake Michigan when day breaks, they come to shore. And so the shores of these Great Lakes get a larger, more than their fair share of birds, let's say. And so we see that reflected in the radar signal with this higher intensity. All right, I'm going to kind of go pretty quickly through this next bit. This is just a sequence of, I guess it's like 62, something like that. Every day in May in 2005, just kind of a sequence of radar images. And what I'll do is I'll just stop on a couple and point out various features that we see and try to hammer home this difference between rain and birds. So here we go. This is just basically ground clutter. It may not be birds. This is rain. So this is May 1st. Here's May 1st in the evening. A lot of scattered rainfall, no particular, we don't have that circular structure, that's rainfall. Here's a couple little pockets of storms, ground clutter again, not all that much going on. Not much going on, kind of scrolling along. Now here's the first big patch of birds. It's that circular and relatively uniform pattern. And you can kind of see, here, not a lot of obstacles to bird migration. It's May, they like to go. It's not a large volume of birds. If we measure the intensity, here at the shore, that's our guide. It looks like it's about 12 dBz. So there are birds that are flying, but not a particularly large number of birds. Here you see that kind of hole in the middle that shows the absence of signal when we're too close to the radar station to actually detect the birds. And then again, the yellow color out in the periphery is a weakening of the signal from birds as the radar signal starts to pass above the height at which the birds are flying. There's another image with birds in it, and you can see that here there's that signal out over the lake of a lot of bird flight out over the lake, and those are all going to come to land once the sun is up. This is still like a half hour before sunrise. Big volume of birds there. You can see, Here's birds, weather. Okay, and here's that kind of, it's probably this stuff that we're seeing out here in the upper left of the radar image on the left is this storm coming in. And you can see just the tip of this thing coming down at the junction of Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. That's right in here. That matches up. This is weather or rainfall. These are birds. You know, here's a little bit more weather down here, these kind of patchy and non-uniform coloration, and here's that basic circular pattern. So hopefully you get the idea. I'll just kind of scroll slowly through these things. There's some other effects here, these kind of wedges, these dark wedges. Here's another dark wedge going out. This represents probably some kind of blockage in the radar signal. Something happened so that when the radar was looking in this direction, when a radar was looking in this direction, it was blocked back at the source by some tall object or something was interfering with it. And so that's kind of the absence of the radar signal. And all this stuff over here is also probably some kind of atmospheric effect as well. So other things pop up on these things. But at the kind of, at least in this area over here, is that same basic circular pattern with a lot of signal for that's evidence of birds. And then some weather down here on the lower right. Rain, birds, birds. Here's a lot of rainfall and probably some lighter rainfall over here. Weather or rain, birds. Fairly weak signal. And I don't think I stressed this earlier, so I'll take an opportunity to do this now. When I'm looking at the signal out here, when there's a lot of rain being detected, you need higher values on your scale to adequately cover the range of return signal power coming from the rainfall. And so the scale can switch. So here, this blue color on this particular chart represents something on the order of 10 to 15 dBz. So that was the same signal strength as some of the red colors that we saw earlier. So when you're trying to get a sense of whether this represents a lot of birds or few birds, you can't go on the color alone. You have to match up the color up with what particular scale is being used at the time. Here's some of these blockages of the radar signal showing up there. So anytime you have these kinds of odd structures, that's something other than radar or birds. This is likely bird migration. Here we go back up, and here's an example where this is that red signal, but on this scale, that's about the same as that blue that we were looking at the other time. All right, so we get a lot of this stuff. It's basically the same story. And I'm going to go through to the end of the month. And then here we have another turn traveling through the month of May. We'll look at a couple of these, but what I'm presenting for the radar signal is now a composite of all the radar stations around the country. This is also something that there's a web address that you can point your browser at to get this imagery. Over here, we have rainfall on the Atlantic coast. Here's some rainfall over in California, some rainfall in the Pacific Northwest, some rain in here, but then these little circular blobs here, these are the signal from birds at each of the various radar stations. Let me pop up to here. Here's another one where this is a radar station located in Nebraska that's seeing a lot of bird migration around it. Bird migration. Here's a little bit weaker signal from birds, but all these little circular patches are birds flying. Here's another one that says all through here, all this stuff that you're seeing there are these circular patterns around the individual radar stations. Well, the stuff that you see down here in Texas, that's the signature from rainfall. And so you can get a sense of where birds are flying over the country by looking at this radar imagery. Here's one where basically from Texas on up through the entire Central Flyway and also along the Mississippi Flyway, we've got migration happening all through here. And it's not that Canada gets bird migration too. There are our friendly neighbors to the north, but this is a display of the US radar stations, and so it's not showing the radar information from up there, and that's why this looks dark. Here's a big storm over on the coastal Carolinas, which you can see over here in the corresponding weather map. There's that big storm that's showing up over here. And then all through the interior of the country, where we've got all this radar signal coming back on the radar stations, our good friends, the meteorologists, have just removed that so we don't even see it. So that's kind of the story on these nationwide pictures. We can see those as well. There's another big day of a lot of migration through the, and you can see also how on the eastern half of the country, we get a lot more bird migration than they do out over the basin and range area of the American West. You can see on our weather maps the basic direction of weather flow from west to east. Okay. Now here's an interesting thing. Here's this, it's a YouTube video. I think we'll show this. And what it's going to show is a time lapse over a particular day in May when there's some strong bird migration. You can see in this fixed image over here, a lot of these blobs represent bird migration. I think some of this stuff in here are some rainstorms, but the rest of it is kind of bird migration. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch over I think it's I don't know how long it is. It's like a 24-hour period or something. I'll read off some times as we watch it, but it'll be a time lapse across the. We'll see birds take off. We'll see them present in the radar imagery overnight, and then we'll see them land. And I may have to fuss around to see what happens here. Okay. Edward, can you chime in and tell me, can you see the map, or do I have to switch my screen?
Yeah, you might have to unshare it and then reshare with the screen that shows the video.
Good deal. Not a problem.
Yeah, and if you guys have questions, please continue to put them in the chat, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards here. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat so we can see them.
All right, so here we go. Here's this thing. All right, so this is at 2 in the afternoon. So here's 2 in the afternoon, 4 in the afternoon. You can see the weather slowly moving across. It's now 6 p.m. Soon the sun is going to set, and now we see the birds taking off, right? And then the birds fill the sky. And one thing, they filled it up from, they first showed up on the eastern seaboard, and then these little blue circular patches came across here, and now we're seeing them start to disappear. It's 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, and so forth, and it's gone. Now we're back into the day. The storm is picked up in intensity. And let's show this again. We'll start out from the beginning. All right, so now we're in the middle of the afternoon, and we're starting to get close towards evening now, and right around now we should start to see stuff happening over here. Here it comes, and then it spreads across, and then we have that kind of rather even intensity just remaining until finally daybreak comes, and then we see things disappear from the right side, and then so that disappearance, it spreads across. And the reason why we see things start over here on the right-hand side and then spread across that way and then go away on the right-hand side and spread across that way is because over in the east side of the country, sunrise and sunset happens an hour before it happens over here. And so we can kind of watch the sunset in the spread of the birds taking off across the airwaves there. Okay, let me go back to what we were showing before. We're close to the end. Okay, where were we? Somewhere down here. All right, what else can we see? BIRDCAST, this is what I mentioned that the people at the Laboratory of Ornithology are working on. And yeah, I guess we want to go look at this too. This is what this kind of looks like. This is integrating image stuff from radar and from weather and from observations in eBird to kind of give a picture. And again, we can kind of look to see, you know, how this is the day's migration here for us, kind of looking ahead or looking back a couple hours to now. And I want to go to, let me figure out what the heck I said here. May 8th in 2018. Yeah, okay. What happened here? All right, so I'm going to change this to May 8th, 2018. And what we're going to see on this is, again, it's this kind of time-lapse thing. You can see the time going from here on the left. This red line that's kind of crossing the screen is sunset. And then a little bit later, we're going to see a yellow line cross the screen, which is going to be sunrise. And these little arrows are indicating the direction that the birds being seen are moving. And so it's maybe a little bit fancier tool for interpreting these kinds of things that's using information from multiple sources. Here it's just scrolling through again. There's sunset happening, and you can see the birds taking off behind the setting sun. And then they're present and they're flying all night. And then the yellow line represents the sunrise coming along, and you can see that that kind of intensity of the image behind the sunset kind of disappears as the birds go down to ground. All right, I'm going back to the presentation. And we're almost done. I guess this is just one more slide talking about this migration forecasting, and there are scientific publications that have been out there kind of with some presenting what's being done and how they're interpreting it and observing the migration. So this is kind of this, although what we were looking at was a picture. That time lapse that we just looked at was a picture using predominantly radar plus some other variables to kind of smooth out the estimates of the volume of birds that were migrating. And this is a paper discussing how you can forecast in the future as to what you expect with regard to the volume of birds migrating, and showing that these predictions that people are able to do right now match up reasonably well with the actual observations. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, in order to kind of observe the birds, and in order to observe birds using radar, expect to see them mostly in the nighttime after sunset and before sunrise. You want to look at the radar image from your favorite source. You want to get something that's providing you the raw radar feed, not the weather services where they take the birds out. Base reflectivity is the strength of the signal. That'll enable you to give you a general idea about what the volume of birds that are aloft are. A lot of these things give you an option to show a loop that will loop over approximately an hour and a half of observations just prior to the time that you're looking. And so if you happen to get up and it's a half hour after sunrise and everything's already landed, you still got in that hour and a half window, an hour that was before sunrise. And so you can see how many birds were aloft there by doing this loop. And I'm happy to demonstrate that if you'd like. And then it's also useful to incorporate a weather map into your interpretation. And you can look at some of these other products as well, the National Mosaic that I showed you, and so forth. In terms of predicting when to go out or how to use this to go out during the good days, basically you can get up in the morning, you can see how many birds were flying just prior to sunrise, for instance. My advice is to, whenever you can go out and bird, just go out and bird. And sometimes you'll see lots of birds. Sometimes you'll see a few birds. In my experience, there are so many variables involved with respect to what you're going to be able to observe at a particular location that it's hard to correlate things necessarily with the strength of the radar signal. But generally, if you've got, you know, something at this 20 dBz or above, there are a lot of birds out there, and you'll have some in your area, and especially if that's correlated, and generally it is correlated with good migratory conditions. Those are good times to go out. But it's as a tool to decide when you're going to go out. You know, I don't know, at least in my life, you know, whether I get to go birding is dictated a lot more by opportunity, not whether the radar is showing lots of birds. I think that's it. I'll stop sharing the screen, and we'll deal with the questions, I suppose.
All right. Wow, that was fantastic. Wow. So we got some questions in here. Some of them look like they have been answered to a certain extent, but the first one we got was from Bob Dolgan. Do you want to ask your question in person? Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, Geoff. My question was, I recall as you watch like sort of meteorologists on TV, they always point out ground clutter when it's dry out and like radar shows something. And I wondered like what that really is, and whether, you know, is that like some of those small movements of birds or insects or something? Just kind of wondering about the concept of ground clutter.
Oh yeah, so ground clutter, you can think of ground clutter is it's when the radar signal is hitting stuff associated with the ground, you know, treetops, buildings, this kind of thing. And there are times at which you have some atmospheric effects that will cause a greater amount of bending of the radar signal. So there's this kind of refraction that happens where the radar signal kind of curves closer to the Earth. And sometimes from atmospheric effects that can be stronger than normal. So the radar is actually striking things that are close to the ground a distance away. And so in a lot of these images, if you see this kind of speckly pattern. I don't know if I can let me see if I can bring some of these things up. I'm just going to get back up into these images here. And so something like this here, that kind of, this is like a rather speckly sort of pattern. That could very well be ground clutter that we're seeing, and that's kind of the characteristic that you see. It's pretty sparse, and even on something like this image here, maybe if I present it, whoa, it did not work, did it? Let me get back up to that image, or any of these. There we go. And so here in this interior, see that speckly kind of stuff? I think I variously described these things as a circular pattern, and I know at least once I used the word donut. You know, there's actually kind of a little hole here in the middle close to the radar station where the radar signal isn't high enough to be hitting the birds, but it is low enough to be catching some ground clutter. And so that very speckly pattern in there is this kind of ground clutter, which the radar will see when the signal is still very low, as it is very close to the station. But as I mentioned before, you can get these atmospheric type things where there's some bending of the signal and you're getting some return from stuff that's generally closer to the ground.
Thank you.
Looks like we also got some questions from John Leonard and John Legg, but it looks like I think Geoff already answered your questions. Hopefully they did. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. A animated video. Oh, so we got Jennifer Gustavo Ustaris. Would you like to ask your question in person? Gustavo, you still here?
Yeah, I don't know, Ed, if Geoff answered my question exactly.
Oh, sure. By all means, go ahead.
You know, I was just wondering if it's possible to take that data that was garbage from weather.com and, you know, the Weather Channel. They throw that out. Is that our golden signal? Can we just get that bird data straight out for us to use?
Okay, so your question is, I mean, what is the golden signal?
The part they throw out. They subtract out the birds. We would like to see the birds only signal. Is that?
Oh, so like do the reverse. Like if you wanted
exactly.
to see only
flip
birds
it.
and get rid of the weather.
Flip it. Just flip it. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe you can get some of the some people with a lot of energy to write an app that'll do that for you. I mean, I don't know how complicated it is to do these kinds of massages and say, for instance, with Bob Dolgan's question where they're leaving the ground clutter in or the ground clutter shows up, that's probably like in between signal that they can't tell whether it's weather or it's something that they want to get rid of or the machine that's doing most of the work. So yeah, I guess from the birder's perspective, being able to see just birds would be a good thing. The nice thing is that we have available to us essentially the raw signal. We get it packaged up in these nice images, these web-based images that we can look at. But I think you can actually get the raw information from the National Weather Service. So an enterprising person might be able to go program something up to do the removal of everything that wasn't birds.
Well, I'm surprised that BIRDCAST at the Lab of O hasn't tried that. It seems funny. I don't.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. It might be that things like maybe things like these kinds of blockage effects or some of the ground clutter or what have you. Maybe there's some challenges to doing that. At least I know that when I look at these things, I can just take the blob that represents migratory birds is pretty easy to pick up on the local radar signal, and just by going to that raw feed, it's easy enough, I think, to visually discriminate between rainfall and birds, and that's the majority of the stuff that you see. Occasionally there are things that I remember, I mentioned Sidney Gothrow's website. He had sample images that showed insect swarms. Now the insect swarms are not present at 4 a.m. The insect swarms are present at like 2 p.m. or something like that when the bird swarms aren't there. And so you get some of these kinds of effects, but that's a good point. But I don't know of any products. I haven't seen any products that are just showing, what the birds are. But probably some of these things, like in BIRDCAST, they have to be extracting that as well, that information, in order to use the estimates of, to get estimates of the volume of the migratory passage.
Gustavo, do you still want to ask your question in person?
Yeah, just wondering if you knew of any organization or group of effort of trying to bundle radar data with Mexico and Canada to be able to see like a whole picture effect of migration for the whole North American region?
That I don't know. I don't know of where that might be done, and it is unfortunate that a lot of these kinds of things end at borders. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's out there. If you find out, please let me know. It's a good point.
Okay, Jennifer Scobie, you got an interesting question. Would you like to ask that in person?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sorry my video camera isn't working.
That's all right.
And I think our speaker already addressed this a little bit, but we had some kind of bummer migration days this May. And we kind of wondered if it was the weather, if birds were somehow choosing to just keep going instead of coming down. And, you know, I just want it all. I just want the magic from all of this. I want to be able to look at, some of my friends seem to be able to do, look at the weather and look at migration and be able to say, aha, tomorrow's going to be a great day. So I'm just looking for whether there's some tips about tying those things together so that we can better predict when the day is going to be a good day.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm gonna end up not answering this question. My personal opinion is that this is a pretty difficult thing to do in order to say, you know, to be at, you know, I don't know, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The evening before, and to decide and to be able to predict accurately that the next day is going to be a really good birding day. I think that that's really hard to do. I've seen a lot of people at least try to do that, and I think the accuracy of their predictions is relatively random. That's my impression. Now, those people that do that, I think, would probably argue with me over that point, but I think that the magic ingredients are essentially, you know, some of these kinds of things are where say during a migratory period where the weather conditions have not been so conducive for migration, and then that has changed, and you can then see, you see, I mean, basically it's in the springtime, there's a warm front and southerly winds coming up after a period of relatively no movement, or in the fall you have a cold front that's coming by, and I think it's a little easier to do in the fall because by and large the movements of cold fronts are a little bit more predictable than the movements of these warm fronts. And so you get a cold front that's coming, you know it's going to pass at some point, and you know, it's shorebirds migrate ahead of the front and the rest of the birds come behind the front. And so if you see a front coming and there's kind of clear skies behind it, you know there's going to be a lot of movements, and you can, on a broad scale, a larger geographic scale, have some pretty good predictions, but on the local scale you don't really know. In the sense that, you know, so sometimes you say, people say like they've predicted a huge number of birds and the prediction didn't pan out. Oh, it must have been because the birds kept flying, and, you know, or because the birds somehow jumped over us. And maybe those things happened, or maybe, you know, maybe it didn't, that maybe, you know, the makeup of the kinds of birds that you were seeing in this radar image were things that were mostly associated with water and you're looking in forests, or they were mostly associated with forests and you're looking for birds flying up and down the lakefront. And so I think it's the kind of thing that when you get a change of weather pattern from something that's not conducive to migration to something that is conducive to migration, then that's something that you can count on, that it's worth going out because things will be happening. But the actual volume of it, I think, is a much harder thing to address.
That was actually super helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think to a certain extent that also answered Katie Scott, if that answered your question. Let me know if it did not. We got another question from Nina, if you will be hosting your North Pond walks in July.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that one I can answer. So the North Pond walk schedule, we would normally have a walk in the middle of July. We are not going to do that one, but it looks like everything will be a go for starting the walks up again in August. But like everything else in these unprecedented times that we live in right now, that the how we manage this, and I think there's going to be sign-ups and a limit on participation, and we'll all wear masks and stay 6 feet apart and this kind of stuff. So there should be some details coming out on that sometime between now and mid-August.
Thank you. Looking forward to that.
All right. I think we got one more. Margaret, you have a couple of related questions. Would you like to ask them in person? Just Margaret.
I suppose I could. I was just looking at the notes I took. I was curious what DBZ actually stands for, what the units are there.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer this specifically, but more sort of approximately. The dB part is a decibel.
Oh, okay.
Z, I believe, references a three-dimensional assessment of what's going on. So it's like a volumetric measure.
Okay. Now, is that a weather metric, or is that specific to
It's
other?
Well, it's something that
conditions.
I mentioned like this sort of logarithmic thing, and so when you go to this decibels, you know, depending on whether you're doing energy or amplitude, it's like a different scale factor multiplying the logarithm of the actual measurement, and so the you know, with these kinds of things, that at least when I look at this, you know, I really don't care what the units are, and I try to keep myself aware of this logarithmic aspect. So zero is not zero. Zero is kind of like unit value. It's sort of like, you know, like a unit value is when the DBZ is at 0. And when the DBZ is at 10, we're at 10 times whatever the heck it was at 0. When we're at 20, we're 100 times whatever it was at 0. And when we're at 30, we're 1,000 times whatever it was at 0. And so, you know, at least for the purposes of looking at this stuff with regard to birds, it's, you know, when I'm at 20, when it's at 20, you know, I'm excited. When I'm at 10, I know there's stuff flying, and stuff that's less than 10, you know, it's negligible. And then when you see you can gauge the intensity of a thunderstorm just by, you know, how many colors are present in the storm. So at least that's my view. So I guess the answer really is, I don't know. You know, other than the fact that it's a decibel thing with this volumetric business, I don't know what the absolute value of the unit means at all.
I was just curious about that. And you did touch on the insects. A lot of it is timing.
Yeah, I think
when you see a density of insect ratings that are getting caught in the radar, it's more of timing to determine what that is.
Oh, yes. So you know, I don't remember, and that radar ornithology laboratory website is no longer in existence, I think. So I don't know where to go get some of those guidelines that they had kind of figured out. But the vast majority of what you will see on the when you look at the radar is this basic circular or donut pattern that's birds, stuff that you learn to associate with rain, and the rest of it is not that much, and you can lump all of it that's got to be other stuff. And you know, there are things like, you know, sometimes you can see, if you know where there are large flocks of waterfowl, say congregating in winter, you know, occasionally these things get up in the air, and those I know you can see you can see this little blip, you know, around some big lake that has a lot of geese. And so that kind of thing will be birds that you see with the geese going up during the day. So, you know, it takes a little bit of, you know, incorporating some of this other secondary information to do an accurate determination of what it is that you're actually seeing, because the radar signal itself, the electromagnetic energy beam, it's just hitting stuff and reflecting off, and it doesn't care what it's hitting. You're getting a signal back no matter what the object that it struck was.
Right. Okay. Which makes it really difficult to predict what actually the radar is bouncing off of.
Yeah, sure. Certainly. But I guess my point is that if you're interested to know what it is that you're looking at other than rain and birds, I think there's some issues to work through there. But if you're interested only in rain and birds, and from the birder's perspective, I think that's a pretty reasonable viewpoint to have, that you can you can get the hang of telling what's birds. You can distinguish pretty readily between rain and birds. And then there are things that you look at and you say, I don't think that's either rain or birds, so it's just something else.
Yeah.
And that's a relatively small fraction of the kinds of things that you're going to be, looking at as you look at these radar images.
But the last question I'll ask in person, regardless of what I've typed, it's curious that there could be an interesting correlation between insects and birds. And so I think that's just a curiosity.
Yeah.
Just a curiosity.
Yeah. I'll point out too that, we've talked about, radar systems. There are a lot of different kinds of radar systems. We're looking at sort of this weather radar product, and, then there's radar that are used to try to keep track of aircraft, and, like the military worries about how to design aircraft so that the signal scatters all over the place and doesn't reflect back to the source, so they go undetected. It's like these stealth aircraft and these kinds of things. There are radar systems that are associated with autonomous vehicles so that they can detect objects near to the car. And so you don't have to just take a big giant radar and kind of point it out where you're going to detect weather as well. You can do other kinds of things. And so for if you wanted to study Mississippi kites or ring-billed gulls eating dragonflies, maybe there's a way to get measurements about the volume of the stuff that's out there using a radar system and figuring out how to tell the birds that are eating the dragonflies apart from the dragonflies as well.
Right.
I'm sure there's also
it just raises just an interest. It's a curiosity.
Yeah.
So I hope somebody's studying that. All right. Well, thank you. Learned a lot. I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, everybody, for all your great questions. This great discussion. Can I get a quick round of applause again for Geoff here? Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to talk to us today. This was really, really informative. I know I learned a heck of a lot here. If you enjoyed that program, please consider either checking out, dropping $1 or $2 in our virtual tip jar, which I put in the chat there. It goes a long way to helping us out. Or even better yet, just straight up becoming a member if you're not already. And also just check out our website for awesome future events. But once again, Geoff, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's really fantastic. And thank you all so much, everybody here, for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thanks for listening.